This is a program about the power of big tobacco and the failure of the Congress to do anything about it.
Congress, which is essentially bought by the tobacco industry, isn't willing to act to save literally tens of millions of American lives.
But this is also a program about the failure of the country's public health leaders. They squandered an opportunity to save millions of lives.
Look what we ended up with, which is a debacle.
The federal government regulates the smoke that comes out of cars and out of factories. But today, it still does not regulate the smoke that comes from a cigarette. Hello, I'm Peter Jennings. We've kept a tobacco file at ABC News for more than 20 years. And by the late 1990s, many people thought that government and the tobacco industry and the public health community had finally made real progress in the campaign against smoking. Tonight, we're going to tell you 3 disturbing stories which will show you how that is wrong and why cigarettes are still the country's #1 killer. For decades, it was good to be big tobacco. The public didn't trust the tobacco companies, but the shareholders did. Tobacco was extraordinarily profitable. Tobacco was killing almost 450,000 people every year, but the tobacco companies never had to pay a penny in lawsuits against them.
Anyone who thought they could outsmart the tobacco industry had been taken for a fool.
Matt Myers has been a public health advocate for 20 years. The tobacco industry was his enemy.
The tobacco industry has been willing to use any tactic whatsoever in order to prevent responsible legislation or action to reduce tobacco use.
And had beat back challenge after challenge after challenge from the public health.
Literally crushed challenge after challenge after challenge.
And then, in 1994, big tobacco began to lose its edge.
1994 was potentially the most important year in tobacco control since the 1964 Surgeon General's report.
In 1994, David Kessler, the commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration, set out to regulate tobacco.
Do you swear that the testimony...
David Kessler said cigarettes were drugs, and the tobacco companies knew it.
Some of today's cigarettes may in fact qualify as high-technology nicotine delivery systems.
Kessler said it was time for the federal government to regulate how cigarettes were made and how they were marketed.
These findings lay to rest any notion that there is no manipulation and control of nicotine undertaken in the tobacco industry.
Never before had a government official taken on the big tobacco companies. David Kessler was portrayed as a hero.
The political power of the tobacco industry had left all past Food and Drug administrations really too scared to even try to do what Kessler started in '94.
If you raise your right hand, do you swear that the testimony...
It was a famous moment. For the first time ever, the CEOs of 7 tobacco companies testified before the Congress.
Please consider yourself to be under oath.
I don't believe that nicotine or our products are addictive.
I believe nicotine is not addictive.
I believe that nicotine is not addictive. I believe that nicotine is not addictive.
Everyone believed they were lying.
I mean, I don't think tobacco executives ever set out to kill people. They just didn't care if they killed people if it would make them more money.
The Brown and Williamson Tobacco Corporation had research as early as 1963.
Thousands of secret industry documents revealed that the tobacco companies knew cigarettes were deadly. The companies covered it up.
I was employed at the Philip Morris Research Center in Richmond, Virginia, as an associate scientist.
The scientists revealed how company research showed that nicotine was addictive. The companies covered it up.
The lab was really quite secretive.
A parade of whistleblowers in the tobacco industry spilled big tobacco's innermost secrets. And an avalanche of lawsuits against the companies began.
Their words, we're in the nicotine delivery business.
Smokers sued, and then government sued. For the first time, a state government is taking the tobacco industry to court on behalf of the taxpayers. In 1994, Mike Moore was the Attorney General of Mississippi. He would become the tobacco company's nemesis.
All my friends told me this is the last political thing you'll ever do. I really didn't care. I knew it was the most important thing that I'd ever do in my life.
What were you hoping to achieve?
Well, what we were hoping to achieve is that we would change the practices of the tobacco industry, make them tell the truth about their product.
Viceroy lights.
And raise your right hand.
For the very first time, Big Tobacco was in trouble.
People saw the tobacco industry falling down on their knees in a really weak position and almost became giddy about it. You know, we're winning, we're winning. We'd get these phone calls, there'd be emails. Look what's happening to them now.
Nancy Kaufman has been fighting the tobacco industry for years.
There were actually people in the public health community saying that the tobacco industry was going to be out of business because of what we had been doing.
It seemed like every day there was a new assault, a new article in the paper, new allegations, new stories on television. It just seemed like it was never going to end.
Steve Parrish. He was a senior executive for Philip Morris in the 1990s. Now he works for its parent company, Altria. In those days, I don't think I'd even been allowed in the building.
I'm sure you wouldn't have been. Any member of the news media would have been barred from our building. I'm sure that's true.
Today, for the first time, Mr. Parrish reveals what it was like inside an industry under siege.
It seemed like 1994 was the year of the perfect storm. There was a sea change in attitudes about the tobacco industry in the United States.
The tobacco tide has turned in America.
They are purveyors of death. Their business...
Just say no to the tobacco industry.
The tobacco industry is engaged in a life and death struggle for its future in their spirit.
10 years ago, the public health advocates believed that Big Tobacco's downfall was inevitable. In the 1994 election, the tobacco companies, as usual, poured huge money into the campaigns of their political friends. 2/3 of the money went to Republicans.
We're winning, we're winning, we're winning.
And when Republicans won control of the Congress, any notion of tobacco's downfall went right out the window. On the Commerce Committee, the Democratic chairman, who had made the company swear to tell the truth, was replaced by the Republican, Thomas Bliley from Virginia.
We have witnessed an unprecedented assault on tobacco.
Bliley was often referred to as the congressman from Philip Morris. The new Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, made it crystal clear what he thought of the plan at the Food and Drug Administration to regulate tobacco.
I think the FDA has lost its mind.
But 2 years later, by 1996, beyond the Beltway, the guerrilla war against the tobacco companies was heating up. The Attorney General of Mississippi, Mike Moore, had managed to convince 19 other attorneys general to join him in colossal lawsuits against the tobacco industry.
Smokers always lose when they sue the tobacco industry because the tobacco companies always say, yeah, it may be bad, but you made the choice. The state was in a different position. The smoker smokes, tobacco companies sell cigarettes. The state pays for treating people with disease. So he figured that the state wouldn't be condemned to the defense of you smoke.
Prior to 1994, the tobacco industry had been sued many, many times in court. What was their record?
The tobacco companies had beaten the heck out of everybody that they'd ever taken on. Nobody had ever beaten the tobacco industry.
Publicly, the tobacco companies were defiant.
This lawsuit and the theory of this lawsuit is not supported by the law of Mississippi or any other state.
But privately, they were terrified. Steve Parrish tells us today they wanted nothing more than to make a deal.
We sensed a sea change about not just the product, but about the people in the industry. And if you have that sort of a shift in attitude, you're not going to survive for long. The notion that we could always fight and win, those days had to end. We just couldn't do that anymore.
What did Philip Morris want to get out of a settlement?
Peace, in a word. We were looking for peace. We were trying to convince the other side to let us surrender.
The Clinton administration thought that a settlement was in the public interest. The White House encouraged Mike Moore to meet with the industry, and Moore agreed on one condition.
The first rule that we set down for these negotiations was, I don't want to meet with any more lawyers. I want to see the CEOs and look them in the eye. You know, they say they want to settle, they say they want to tell the truth, they want to change the industry's practices. I want to look at them eye to eye and judge that sincerity.
On April the 3rd, 1997, at the Sheraton Hotel outside Washington, in great secrecy, the CEOs of Philip Morris and R.J. Reynolds sat down with Mike Moore and one of the most trusted public health advocates in the country, Matt Myers.
It was really an extraordinary meeting. It began with the CEO of Philip Morris and R.J. Reynolds saying that they were prepared to make the kind of fundamental change that was probably unimaginable to us even days before.
The industry opened with an offer to make dramatic changes. They were even open to regulation by the Food and Drug Administration. And as a symbolic gesture, the companies offered to give up 2 of their advertising icons.
The chairman of Philip Morris said, we are prepared to give up the Marlboro Man, and R.J. Reynolds is prepared to give up Joe Camel. And I think that got people's attention.
Come to Marlboro country.
We're just on the other side of the table. Of course, we're going, this is great. I mean, this is wonderful. The Marlboro Man is the biggest advertising icon in the world. And within a day and a half, we had the agreement that the Marlboro Man was going to be dead.
Did you ever think that a moment like this might come?
It never dawned on me that we could put ourselves in a position where the tobacco industry would feel the need to make the kind of concessions that they were prepared to make.
The company said they were ready to pay hundreds of billions of dollars in healthcare costs for which they had been sued. But in return for all this, they wanted something. They wanted some immunity from lawsuits. Otherwise, they said, the companies would not survive.
Of course, they didn't deserve anything, but if they were going to support the deal, they needed to get something out of it. Otherwise, it's not a deal.
The secret negotiations moved along quite quickly. But then someone talked to a reporter. When the news of these talks leaked to the public health community, what was the reaction?
An explosion unlike the public health community has ever seen before.
Did others in the public health community think you were a traitor at that stage?
Yes, absolutely.
It's inconceivable to me that anybody representing the public interest ought to be sitting there and negotiating immunity for the tobacco industry.
The time is not right for settlement. The tobacco industry must be held accountable.
The industry must not be allowed to bail itself out from their decades of lies and deceit.
Most of the big players in the public health community were outraged.
They absolutely objected to ever making any sort of deal with the tobacco industry. Their goal was to put the tobacco industry out of business.
Virtually no one said a word about the huge concessions the tobacco companies were making. All the focus was on the offer of legal protection to the industry.
If negotiators, other negotiators around the table, want to stand up this weekend or whenever they want to stand up and say there's an agreement, they do that at their peril.
David Kessler's public attack on the negotiators was a surprise to Moore and Myers. They were winning concessions from the industry on all the issues that Kessler had fought for.
I think our deal was absolutely a good deal because what we got on the other side was FDA regulation of nicotine. Hopefully the effect of that was going to drive down the number of addicts, drive down the number of deaths and disease. If we could cut the deaths and disease by half, I don't care how much money it'd save the tobacco industry.
Despite the protests, the negotiations continued.
The last 2 days of negotiations have been rocky and hard and tough and brutal, sometimes mean. Decided we'd stop by and say hello.
The White House kept encouraging the negotiators.
What I consistently hear from the White House is our #1 concern is the public health of this country.
And then on June the 20th, 1997, after months of contentious back and forth, the attorneys general and the tobacco companies announced they had reached a settlement.
I got the most important public health plan in history right here. We wanted to do something that would punish this industry for their past misconduct, and we have done that.
The states had extracted more from big tobacco than anyone had ever imagined possible. The companies would ban advertising billboards and vending machines. There would be stronger warning labels on cigarette packages and full disclosure of what was in a cigarette. The companies would stop marketing to children. The companies would pay $368 billion to settle the state's lawsuits. They would fund anti-smoking campaigns on a permanent basis. And the companies agreed to be regulated by the government.
We thought we had accomplished something huge for this country. We just had dreams that the public health of this country was going to be improved. It's a very emotional day. It really was. Very exciting day, but very emotional.
There was just one more thing to do. The agreement had to be turned into a federal law, passed by the Congress and signed by the president. As Mike Moore left for the White House, he had every reason to believe that President Clinton would be excited.
Before we announced the settlement, they said, here's what the president's going to say. They read it to me.
What was the president going to say?
He was going to say, this is a wonderful improvement in the public health. This is going to do great things. I mean, he put his arms around it.
We had been led to believe all along the way that the substance of that agreement would be endorsed by the White House.
What happened?
It never came.
For some reason, the president was backing off.
These folks have been working hard, and they've done their best, and now we should look at it and make our judgments.
Translation: something had changed. The president's support was now in question. The settlement was in trouble. At the beginning of 1998, Mike Moore was one of the loneliest men in Washington. The settlement with the tobacco companies was in limbo. The Clinton White House wasn't pushing it. And Mike Moore was still being attacked by the public health community.
They kept telling us, we don't need this settlement. We'll get incremental improvements in the public health. Y'all just go back to Mississippi and wherever else and settle your little lawsuits, and we'll take care of this big picture up here in Washington.
But Moore was not ready to give up.
Every day we delay, 3,000 more kids start smoking, and 1,000 of them are going to die.
And after 9 months of lobbying to turn the settlement into a law, he found an ally in Senator John McCain.
If I had to get into a hole with somebody and fight to the end, it would be John McCain, because he doesn't get out and doesn't give up until the fight's completely over, until you've won.
This was an industry that had lied and deceived in the face of overwhelming scientific evidence, which they had accumulated, and caused the needless death and injury to I don't know how many Americans.
McCain was chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee.
Our first priority with this proposed legislation is to prevent kids from smoking.
In only 3 weeks, using Mike Moore's settlement as raw material, McCain drafted a comprehensive tobacco control bill that was much tougher on the industry.
And the bill we've agreed upon is tough medicine for a tough problem.
Senator McCain set out systematically to look at the flaws in the 1997 settlement and to correct them. He listened to everybody who had a criticism of the 97 settlement.
McCain relied on the now former FDA Commissioner David Kessler and the retired Surgeon General C. Everett Koop to draft a bill they would support.
He cleaned up in that legislation much of the problems we had with the public health measures.
You know, they added money to it, they added some provisions, they tightened up some FDA regulations, increased the advertising and marketing restrictions, and, you know, grew a $368 billion bill into about a $550 billion bill.
But the public health components of the McCain bill went beyond any public health advocate's wildest dreams.
Absolutely. They really were everything that we could have ever asked for.
But now the tobacco companies were getting anxious. The companies had agreed to lobby their allies in Congress to support a settlement, but now they thought the legislation was getting too punitive.
The cost kept going up because there was a perception that we'd agree to anything because we were desperate.
We had to be careful that we were coming perilously close to the point where the tobacco industry would walk away from the agreement.
The companies were still insisting on some legal protection from lawsuits in return for the public health benefits. David Kessler was reluctant.
The question was whether we were going to trade one for the other. The question was, were we going to make the ultimate deal?
To satisfy the public health community, McCain's bill assured that the companies could be held liable for unlimited sums of money if they lost in court. But he did give the companies something, a limit on how much they would have to pay in a single year, $6.5 billion.
It gave them limited liability protection. In my view, it was appropriate, particularly since we were getting hundreds of billions of dollars to conduct anti-smoking and programs and treatment of tobacco-related illnesses.
I'm very pleased to convene this morning's executive session to mark up comprehensive bipartisan tobacco legislation.
On April the 1st, 1998, in the Commerce Committee, which had many allies of the tobacco industry on it, McCain was able to accomplish the unthinkable.
Mr. Burns.
Aye.
Mr. Gorton.
Aye.
Mrs. Hutchison. Aye.
The bill was approved in committee by 19-1. Senator Ashcroft voted against it.
Ashcroft.
Oh.
He said at the time it wasn't tough enough.
The bill will be placed on the calendar and reported to the Senate, and this markup is adjourned.
Good job, John.
I was near euphoric because we'd worked so hard to work it through the committee in a vote of 19-1.
Yeah.
I thought we were on our way.
This is a great tribute to your leadership.
This all meant that tobacco companies would pay billions of dollars to help people quit smoking, especially teenagers. And the government would finally control how cigarettes were made and sold. Millions of lives might be saved. Everyone believed the bill was now on its way to becoming law.
The day that the Senate Commerce Committee approved Senator McCain's bill was a day the public health community should have rejoiced.
But that is not what happened.
Indeed, if you told me that this segment had been written by a representative of the tobacco industry, I would fully believe you.
C. Everett Koop and David Kessler, the two leading public health advocates in the country, attacked the legislation.
No bill is better than a watered-down bill.
I was deeply, deeply disappointed at the behavior of both of them.
Did you believe that Dr. Kessler and Dr. Koop would support your legislation?
There's not a doubt in my mind. They both personally assured me that they would.
How important was it to have their support? How critical to the legislation?
It was very critical. They were two of the most respected men in America on this issue, and it was critical.
Senator McCain said that you gave him assurance that you would support the bill with liability protection in it, but you changed your mind, and he doesn't know why.
It really was the ultimate bargain put in front of you. Right? Everything you ever worked for, everything you ever wanted, you could have. But there's only one little catch. Why do you have to tie those public health measures to legal liability protection for the industry?
Perhaps it's the only way to get a deal.
Why? Because you have to pay off the industry?
And you were prepared to ignore all of the public health components based on a $6.5 billion liability protection on an annual basis.
It's not about the dollars. It's about assuring the industry its future.
Some people would say that you are too deeply engaged in the war and unable to recognize a peace settlement.
Peace with the industry? I'm not going there.
I think a lot of us were surprised. In fact, someone I remember made the comment to me, these guys don't know how to say yes.
And when Kessler and Koop attacked the bill, the tobacco companies thought a bad situation could only get worse.
New taxes, new spending.
So they turned against the settlement, and in a huge ad campaign, they now cast the legislation as a tax increase.
I don't like this bill.
Pro-tobacco senators, who already thought the legislation was too tough on the industry, could now oppose the bill, using Dr. Koop's and Dr. Kessler's criticism as ammunition.
But we have provisions in the bill that protect the tobacco companies.
I say let's go get the tobacco companies, but let's talk the right talk.
Mr. D'Amato, no. Mr. Campbell, no.
The legislation died in the full Senate. Senator McCain is convinced to this day that landmark legislation was defeated by the two great pillars of the public health community, Kessler and Koop.
I think history will show that they squandered a historic opportunity, and now we have a situation where none of their goals are being met.
The irony here, one could argue, is that some of the leading public health officials in the country and the tobacco companies ended up on exactly the same side.
They did, and they succeeded in killing the legislation.
We knew we'd get attacked from the right. We never anticipated that the far left would attack us. Kessler became part of that, and Koop became part of that. We never anticipated you'd get shot from the front and shot from the back. I mean, I never figured that out.
It was the most comprehensive anti-tobacco bill ever.
And we will get there, Peter.
But have you ever thought that you might have to wait a very long time in order to get the public health components that would satisfy you, and that it would take so long that many people might needlessly die?
I understand that there are downsides to waiting, regrettably, people continue to die. But we need to get this right, and we need to get this right for the duration.
In the 6 years since the McCain bill failed, the Congress has not passed a single piece of tobacco control legislation. And 2.5 million more Americans have died from smoking.
The division in the public health community contributed to the failure, and in the end, I think, caused us to lose an opportunity that was truly, although I hope I'm wrong, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. It's a tragedy.
Our next story from the tobacco file is about betrayal and neglect. After the McCain bill failed in the Congress, the individual states made a collective settlement of their lawsuits against the tobacco companies. There would be no government regulation of how cigarettes are manufactured, but they agreed on a few marketing restrictions, and the companies agreed to pay the states $246 billion over 25 years. The states promised they would use much of the money in the fight against smoking. And then the states went out and broke the promise. Virginia used some of the tobacco money to pay for new seats at a speedway. New York bought sprinklers and golf carts for this course near Buffalo. Georgia used tobacco money to renovate a hotel. Alabama helped fund a boot camp for teenagers, nothing to do with smoking. And North Carolina actually spent some of its tobacco settlement money on a tobacco warehouse, just like this one.
I think it's obscene and outrageous. It's enough to make an innocent a little cynical.
Did people come to you and make promises that they would use this money for public health and for tobacco control?
The commitment was made by the National Governors Association, the National Associations of Attorneys Generals, and the governors individually, that money would only be used for tobacco-related purposes.
The governors, the legislators, and the attorneys general all said the same thing. Trust us, we'll spend the money on what this fight was about. Well, fast forward, where are we?
Well, we're in Florida. Florida took the tobacco money and put it to good use.
Hey, Dan, how you doing?
How are you, buddy?
We just stopped by to let you know that we at Union Tobacco really appreciated your business. 30 years.
In 1999, Florida spent $70 million on a huge anti-tobacco campaign aimed specifically at teenagers.
I don't know how we'll ever replace you.
The tobacco industry loses over 1,000 customers every day.
They called it the Truth Campaign.
Guess who's been chosen to replace them?
What?
This truth message that we're bringing has power.
In Florida, many kids got seriously into quitting.
It's something that we as a generation believe in.
Many kids became activists. Jacob Bain was a leader.
Our message wasn't don't smoke. It wasn't just say no to tobacco. Our message was the tobacco industry is manipulating you. Now do something about it.
In the category for most deaths in a single year, the nominees are suicide.
These television ads were so effective they were copied all over the country.
Tobacco.
That's why the truth message was so appealing to the youth of Florida, is that it made them feel like they could do something to defend their generation, to stand up for themselves and for what was right.
And the winner is tobacco.
This was the largest state-run anti-tobacco campaign ever designed for young people.
In the first 2 years of its tobacco prevention program, they reduced smoking among middle school students by close to 50%. It was the kind of decline in tobacco use that you could have only dreamed of.
This year, the Youth Summit in Florida devoted to tobacco control was a shadow of its former self. The state has gutted the program. Despite getting more than $414 million from the tobacco settlement this year, Florida's Governor Bush and the state legislature gave the anti-tobacco campaign only $1 million. The tobacco industry spends that on marketing cigarettes every hour, every day.
$1 million.
Mike Moore was at the summit this year. He told the students they had been betrayed.
The legislature's not helping you. The governor of this state's not helping you. If you got a program that's working and it's saving lives and it's going to save you hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars in health care costs down the line, you don't turn it off, you turn it on.
I want to thank all you smokers out there. This one's for you.
All of the ads that had done so much to cut teenage smoking have been taken off the air. There was no money to pay for them.
The truth.
What was once the most effective tobacco control program in the country, perhaps, has now become close to nothing. It's virtually non-existent.
And we've already begun to see an increase in smoking among younger people.
All the states together have now been given billions of dollars by the tobacco companies. Only 5% of the money has been spent to actually fight smoking.
Peter, I call it moral treason. I mean, why did we fight this fight? Why did we go through all that we went through from 1990 through all the way through this thing and take on this huge industry? There's no question in my mind we'd have 50% reduction in teen smoking by today if all the states had lived up to their agreement or if we'd have passed the original settlement.
The tobacco wars are still not over. Cigarettes are still unregulated by the government. And if you want to see the absurd consequences of this, consider the drug nicotine. What is the role of nicotine in health?
Nicotine doesn't cause cancer. Nicotine isn't a cause of lung disease, emphysema, bronchitis. Nicotine in and of itself isn't a huge health problem other than addiction.
Nicotine is addictive, though today virtually every scientist says it is no worse for you than caffeine in coffee. But look at how the government regulates nicotine products designed to help people quit smoking, compared to how the government fails to regulate cigarettes.
We have this bizarre topsy-turvy world in which we do regulate the safest forms of nicotine delivery that have ever been invented. The nicotine replacement products, they're heavily regulated. We don't regulate at all the dirtiest form of nicotine delivery, the cigarette.
If a cigarette company wants to come out with some new type of cigarette, they can do that this afternoon. If they want to reformulate it, they can come up with a new formula this evening. I mean, there's nothing to constrain them.
No regulatory process to get a new tobacco
Nothing.
product on the market. You're saying that government makes it totally easy to buy the product that kills us and extremely difficult to buy the product which will save us.
Exactly. If we came along and said, how do you think we could perpetuate a major epidemic? We're doing a real good job of it.
Government has always allowed the tobacco companies to make cigarettes any way they want and say pretty much anything about them.
Kent has the right kind of mildness.
In the 1950s, when the dangers of smoking were first revealed, tobacco companies added filters and implied they made smoking less dangerous. More people took up smoking.
You'll feel better about smoking with the taste of Kent, Kent with the Micronite filter.
The Micronite filter was made with asbestos.
And that's why you'll feel better about smoking, with a taste of Kent.
There was no regulation in the 1960s when tobacco companies made light cigarettes and promoted them as an alternative to quitting. They were not.
It was a fraud, and it was a fraud that has cost us millions and millions of lives because people who would have quit smoking chose not to do so. They switched to True and a bunch of other cigarettes.
Is a light or ultralight cigarette any safer in any way, shape, or form than other cigarettes?
No. Today, 70%, 75% of Americans smoke light cigarettes. And there was no change in heart disease risk, and there was no real change in lung cancer risk.
Most smokers still believe light cigarettes are safer.
It doesn't burn all the way down, right?
Today, several tobacco companies may be at it again. Brown & Williamson makes a cigarette called Advance, which they say has reduced toxins. R.J. Reynolds has one called Eclipse. They say that if you're not quitting, our cigarette is the next best choice. Without government regulation, we haven't got the vaguest idea what the truth is.
The worry today is that if we have the tobacco industry dictating to us what's a safer cigarette, that it's going to be a fraud again.
The level of trust with the tobacco industry is virtually nil. And if this is the industry we're going to rely upon to come up with safer products, we are going to be very, very cautious.
So you might be surprised to find that the largest tobacco company in the world, Philip Morris, is the only cigarette maker lobbying for government regulation of tobacco products. But why would Philip Morris want to be regulated after all these years in which they have been left pretty much alone?
I believe that there is no set of voluntary steps that one company or even the entire industry can take that will do away with the intense mistrust that people in this country have of the tobacco industry.
Which is part of the reason they let us into company headquarters in Richmond, Virginia. Here, in the labs which no reporters have seen before, Philip Morris is trying to develop a cigarette that the government may agree is safer.
Conventional cigarette, 90% of the tobacco just gets burned up.
Jack Nelson is president of operations, and this is one of their ideas, a special cigarette in a battery-powered lighter. The tobacco gets heated at a much lower temperature than cigarettes usually burn.
Well, the burning generates 4,000 to 5,000 compounds in cigarette smoke. By not burning, maybe we cut those by a significant amount.
And do you have to have this cigarette specifically in order to go into this holder?
That's correct. A conventional cigarette won't work.
People, of course, tell us all the time you simply can't be trusted. Why do you think people should believe you now?
Well, I don't think people should only trust us. That's why we support federal regulation of the tobacco industry.
If Philip Morris gets the government seal of approval for a safer cigarette, that could certainly cause less death and devastation among smokers. It could also be worth a fortune.
If Philip Morris can do it and get it right, and they've got the resources to do it, they could become the tobacco monopoly of the United States of America and put the other companies out of business.
It is a business strategy for survival.
I believe that for this industry to survive, that it needs to meet or exceed society's expectations of it as an industry. I think the federal government ought to have the ability to require manufacturers to change the way they make their products so that they can potentially reduce the very significant harm that's caused by smoking in this country.
Just before we close the tobacco file this time, a reminder of what the tobacco companies are up against in their search for a safer cigarette, and what government knows about the cigarettes they have failed to regulate so far, and what smokers are always up against every time they light up. Those 5,000 chemicals in cigarette smoke: formaldehyde, benzene, DDT, arsenic, nickel, cobalt, lead, ammonia, methane, cadmium. As of now, without regulation, no one but the tobacco industry has any control over what the smoker inhales. I'm Peter Jennings reporting from the Tobacco File. Good night.